So as we get into this work, just know that with Team Intelligent, have what we consider a complete suite to enable the talent conversation, whether it's at the individual contributor level to the executive level, whether it's about dealing with high potential questions, or team and team development questions. And so we think, as we've been working very hard to create a coverage of all of these key questions that you see in this circle of how to help organizations deal with those particular challenges. Now, I like to share that throughout this whole process, Bob and I we developed a methodology early on, which said, what are some of our big questions that we feel is important to answer? And then each of us would give ourselves an assignment and then go off and collect some research and collect additional conversations that we would have with other people with expertise in particular areas. And then we would come back and talk about and hammer out a structure for how we wanted to approach. And as you know, I'm sure, Bob is very committed to an evidence-based approach, and I built my career off of saying to clients and customers, I'll do my best to put in front of you what the evidence tells us is the best solution. And it's not always going to be neat or simple, but it's going to be what I can with some confidence say is a data-based approach to dealing with issues, like in the case today, teams. And when we look at that data, because of, in this case, the experience and history that Bob and I have, not only in all areas of talent management, but also in everything from being a coach with managers and executives to coaching teams, to doing a variety of research initiatives to understand teams. We do like to look at what do the trends and patterns say to us, and what does that imply about what other people need to do. And if we encourage people based on our analysis to do various things, can we follow that evidence and see to it that in fact we are honoring our values about evidence and our best advice, best perspective on whatever the particular talent question happens to be. Now, when it comes to this particular question of teams, there are a couple of elements I want to highlight. One, you may have seen, if you are a member of APA, you may have seen a little more than a year and a half ago now, they did a compilation of the most current research on teams across multiple environments: health environment, science, engineering, just multiple environments. And it was the most current look at what are some of the key variables in teams. No surprise that when an inquiring mind, like a young manager at Google, who is not a social scientist, but Ms. Ravinsky, she made a notation that she had some teams that were performing exceedingly well and some teams not doing so well. And yet, when she looked at them, both teams had incredibly talented people. They both were with very complex problems. And yet one team was far excelling the other team in deliverables, and she wanted to understand why. And then it occurred to her, well, maybe other managers have made the same observation. And sure enough, as she talked to them, they did too. They had some teams that were outstanding and yet very talented. The other group of folks who were on the team who were disastrous, that could hardly really get out of their own way in dealing with various team issues. So she then bumped the question up to higher management and said, don't you think, since there are a lot of us who have this observation, we ought to check this out and see what do we know within Google matters for a team to be successful. And they approved her project, whereby she wanted to study teams throughout Google to get a handle on what in the world was going on with all these very talented people, where some teams were so successful and others not. And that became the Aristotle Project. The Aristotle Project has been written about in multiple forums. It's widely well, actually, he's written about several times in the New York Times. It's shown up in various business magazines. And if you read the details of the report, you get the clear sense that the questions they were asking were all the questions each and every one of us on this webinar would ask. The kinds of variables they were trying to make sense of are all the variables that we would want to make sense of. And if you map what they were exploring with the research, like what I just mentioned in the APA journal, you would find that they were doing a daggone good job of looking at the issues of what it is that makes the biggest difference with teams. And I'm going to talk more about the Google project in a little bit. Now, many of you may have worked with the team architect that Mike Lombardo and Bob Eichinger and Kara Capetta, and I think Vicki, you were part of that. I don't think she's with us today, but anyway, that product was popular, but as you may know, I believe it's been shelved by the buyer of the Lomminger material. When Bob and I created Teamosity, we were thinking about, and we believe the evidence was suggesting that teams for the future were really going to be a vital part of the economic success of enterprises, and that teams needed to be our focus. And that's why we created the iPad app, Teamosity. And we had several other team products on the docket. And then we took a little sidestep in response to a question about, well, what are you guys thinking about these days when it comes to leadership development? In addition to that kind of work, there's been, as all of you know, the work on brain-related research. I started actually in my first job, which was after I finished graduate school. I was the first director of the University Learning Center at Wake Forest University, and we had responsibility for the learning issues for undergraduates all the way up through to the medical school. And because our medical school was one of the first to really explore learning disabilities, I got connected with the neuroscience labs and began a long journey of what I think of as behavioral neuroscience. It's been a fascinating exploration and something that I feel very strongly about, and it's very much informed the way we've thought about all of the work that we've put together. Bob's been passionate about brain science over the last decade, and together we felt that it was really important to make sure when we looked at these various talent management issues that we were mindful of those kinds of things. And one of the pieces that's come out of the brain research is, as we know, the Kahneman work on system 1, system 2 in the brain, and that led to the discovery and identification of all kinds of biases. And a recent book called Wiser is a deep look at how are the various psychological biases that come into play in teams. What can you do first to acknowledge and be aware of them? And it is my view that these biases feed the maladies in many ways that we're going to talk about, and what it is we might focus on there. One of the things that has been significant in my way of thinking and working with individuals as well as with groups is really formulated by Bob Kagan's work out of Harvard on frames of meaning that people bring to their everyday experience. And I often have found, since being introduced to and then trained in his materials, that what some people identify as a personality conflict on teams isn't a personality conflict. It's a conflict of meaning making that's going on between team members. And part of the task or strategy is to find a pathway to allow those two different ways of making sense of an experience such that they can look at each other and be on the same road. And one of the things that I believe the libraries do, especially the pragmatic way we've approached it, is it in fact enables a group of folks being trained or consulted with related to teams to cut through those differences in the most meaningful and productive way, so that the meaning making that's happening, that's very, very basic to the individual differences, um, we can actually use that energy in productive and useful ways. Kagan's work, I think, is quite seminal, and has now begun to permeate all kinds of other frames around working with and developing not only individuals but groups. His newest book, An Everyday Culture, is really about what we do in organizations to foster the development of others, keeping in mind the different levels of meaning making that tends to go on. And that the notion of grasp is really just connected to the brain research. And all I'm going to say about that is, one of the messages that you will hear from us is, we know it takes time for people to learn. It's gradual. There has to be reinforcement mechanisms in place for it to stick. People have to have opportunities to repeat their understanding and to practice their understanding. And what we know too is that a stimulus control is not just simply about the external environment, but it's also about internal environment. It's also about the internal random thoughts and worries that come into play that can insert itself in such a way as to distract people from being productive and to distract people from the learning that we would like. So I'm going to ask you, I'm going to launch a poll here, and I hope it's popped up on your screen. Do you see a poll that asks you 2 questions? Yes? No? Yes. All right, so you should be able to pop an answer to each of the 2 questions, and there are several options that you can choose from on the poll. Please now make your votes. Let me see why it's not letting you vote. You should be able to vote. Votes are happening. All right. So it looks like now everybody has voted. As you can see, I hope you can see, since this is a new polling system for me with them, with Zoom, do you actually see the tallies on the screen? No?
No.
Do you see them now?
Yes.
Good. Great. Thank you. So you can see that the vast majority of us are saying that you found that teams typically don't get a lot of training, and very often nothing specific to teams. So we're probably not surprised by that. And certainly it is my experience that organizations aren't smart about this. They throw people together because of their expertise together, and they think it's going to make magic happen with the team. And then I ask you what you thought of as the greatest team need. And the number 1 item, you could actually vote for several, as you could see, was interpersonal effectiveness. No surprise, I'm sure, to any of us. And of course, EQ being way up there on the list. So that's interesting to see those perspectives. Pretty much follows what the evidence says in other settings. And I thank you for taking time to do that. This particular quote showed up in a Forbes weekly not too long ago. And it was fascinating to see that the notion that teams is supposedly perceived as the model that organizations are going to need to move to. And I happen to believe that COVID-19 is going to drive this issue even more intently as we move forward. How do we do actually replicate the kind of environment that I talked about in my experience in organizations. Now, there are all kinds of different definitions on teams, and generally speaking, when folks are looking at teams or either studying or talking about them, they have in mind what could be a work group, which typically is not dealing with a very complex problem, and typically there's not much collaboration that's needed. It could be a more complicated problem and require more time, where more collaboration is necessary. And then we get to folks who are meeting on a regular basis to try to deal with an issue. They've figured out a way to operate together and to make decisions, and we typically call that a team. Where we get to high performance team interest is when, in fact, we know there's typically a very complex set of goals. It's going to take more time. Folks are working at a high level of collaboration for that to occur. And I would suggest to you that if I had a magic line to draw, there's really a pretty significant line between a collaborative work group and a team. And I'll say more about that. And not only do I think in my own experience have I seen that gap to be pretty big, but I think it's the gap that it most needs to be paid attention to if we in fact are going to get folks to work as a team and move toward a high performing team in the business setting. What you see is an extract from a source that said, look, you know, when you look in the business world, there are these kinds of teams. And I actually don't think these definitions hold much anymore. And in our current situation, I suspect we're going to see a reformulation or in some ways, perhaps even a redefinition of what we think of as teams and how teams operate. Almost everybody says, who researches this question, that teams will produce better quality life experience and work-life balance, that typically there's lower absenteeism and lower turnover and higher motivation and flexibility of the organization to address customer and market demands and pressures. And I would say I certainly saw that to be true in the organization where I talked about that a little bit earlier. In Project Aristotle, when they saw that, in fact, there was a massive gap between those teams that were high performing and those groups that were working but could hardly work well together, what they found were 5 factors. I've sort of put 2 of them. I think they seem to me to be awfully closely related. They're brothers and sisters, which has to do with the importance of the work. One of the things they identified is that individuals on a team where they felt personally that what they were doing is meaningful, that was one factor. And they also felt that the team's work was making a significant impact on the enterprise or the particular context they were in. I put them 2 together to call it the importance of the work. But the variable that both proved to be the most significant and the most puzzling for them, because they're not psychologically minded like we are, was what they called psychological mindedness. And if you were to read the report, you would get a chuckle out of how mystified they are of this thing called psychological safety that you and I know is vital for groups to work. And the examples they give in the report are examples about how people can talk to each other and the rules that they make to make sure that everybody has a fair chance. So for example, one of the things that the report noted was that teams that had rules about how much time each person was allowed to talk and monitored that outperformed those that didn't have any rules on that. And what was interesting was the teams that had come to the view that we need to set a time, that each team member gets a certain amount of time to talk about a particular issue or topic and monitor that, encouraged people to say, what they wanted to say and felt that they would have a fair opportunity to express their view. And so it's kind of interesting that was seen as a part of what's required for psychological safety. So, and we'll come back to that in a minute, and I'll show you how it connects with our team library and the ways in which we've come at that. We have seen that there are all kinds of research that shows that when you really are wanting to solve serious problems, having a team to do that is likely to produce more innovation and better solutions than when you are trying to do this as an individual manager or executive, or maybe one or two managers and executives together. Well, I've said here the very first error is the assumption that talented people thrown together with expertise can become a team. That's error number one. And the second error is ignoring the fact that that's never going to happen. Just throwing people together and expecting them to be able to get to where a team actually operates just simply doesn't happen until somebody takes the initiative and says, a team is a different animal than a work group or a problem-solving group, and we want to address that, what that group needs to become a team. If you look at all kinds of different studies and you thematicize the studies, they will tell you that these are the known needs of teams, that how you select the team members, how the goals are defined, what the boundaries and who are the stakeholders with teams. Nothing, as you look at that list, is a surprise to you. And I want you to know that as we thought about our library and as Bob and I began to put our material together, we had in mind all these threads in the research, and we had in mind what different sources tell us, a team absolutely must have X, Y, and Z, which led us to the creation of our cassette library, that's knowledge, skills, and attributes of teams. And with all of our libraries, we have a structure. With the team structure, there are performance drivers. With the role structures, meaning individual contributors, managers, or executives, we have what we call roles, which are critical patterns of behavior essential to that level of the organization. Well, with teams, because we're looking at the way a group of people work together, we call these 10 performance drivers, which are essential for a team to be effective. And we have practices that teams need to engage in, or managers of teams need to engage in order for the team to achieve these particular drivers to be successful. Now, no surprise, as we got into looking at this, we began to pay attention to what we called maladies. What are the things that begin to seep in the cracks that sap the energy of the people who are working together to try to solve problems as a team? What are the things that can sap the energy, sap the creativity, that can be really knock the legs out of a team trying to get across the finish line? And today's focus really is going to be on those maladies. And the reason why I'm making a big deal about the library is that part of the reason why those maladies emerge is because of the lack of attention to certain kinds of practices. And I'm going to link the maladies to the practices, which are the solution, which are the key solutions to solve those difficult problems with teams. You see on the screen what our key drivers are and the way in which we've organized the practices into 4 domains. The domains serve very particular purposes. We think of it as the kind of meaningful way to organize how the practices relate to each other. So the domain on positioning for success, when you look at what's there, won't surprise you that all those practices are focused on that notion of how we help the team position for success. There's a domain on optimizing teamwork. What are the things that really must be done for the team to work well together? The relationship issue, just as you said in the little survey we did, is vital to attend to, and how those relationships are fostered and leveraged, critical. And there are, because of the fluid dynamic that happens in organizational life, there are a variety of issues that emerge that teams need to be prepared to flex on to assure their ongoing success. So as we settled on the drivers, as I said to you before, associated with each of the drivers are particular practices that we know the teams need to engage in order for the teams to be driven to the level of success they'd like to have. No surprise if you've looked at any of our materials that there is a card deck that goes with our libraries that gives you the narrative on the A side and the observables on the B side. I shared the story of the narratives with a group yesterday, and I hadn't really thought about it being important as to why the narratives are there. And there are two things about it. The longer paragraph narrative, almost all of them are around 100 words, and I'll tell you why that in a second. What we know is, based on a whole variety of research, there's some people for whom narrative enables the information to stick better than a list of bullet points. For some, the list of bullet points around observables, for example, sticks better and speaks to them more directly. So as Bob and I looked at that research and we thought about this, we also knew the research telling us that a story narrative is more powerful than a simple definition. So when we started throughout all of our libraries, on every single one of them, we actually, what we would do is we would divide the topics and we would go off and write our story narrative. And most of the time was about 1,000 words or so. Then we would exchange the narrative with each other and then start editing and work at getting to the core story that captured the practice that we felt was really critical. And so we made ourselves, and I used to call it rigorously and without mercy, edit our material to get to the 100 words. And sometimes it's 99 words, sometimes it's 109 words around each and every practice. And the story there is intended to give a context that's meaningful. You are not surprised that we weighted the practices in terms of developmental difficulty. If you're working with teams, it's going to be important to know that if there's a particular malady that needs a particular practice focus, how difficult is it going to be? And our distribution of difficulty is provided on one of our placemats. And so you're able then to go say, oh, wow, 3 or 4 of the things we need to work on that's getting in the way of this team are easier things to do. So we can create a curriculum, if you will, around that. It could be that 3 or 4 things are the hardest to do, and we need to choose one to work on the next 6 months in order to get the team where it needs to be. Now, when Bob and I did our weightings, we used a variety of variables. We actually had 9. These are the 6 we talked about the most, where we kept saying, well, on this particular practice, how much of this behavior is going to be hardwired and how much of it is tied to skill training and skill development? How much of it is dependent upon experience and exposure to various things in order for this behavior to be understood and to take place? And so we went through and we did this kind of weighting to make our determinations about the strength of each of the practices and the developmental challenges. And then we also said, well, let's take a look at what it means to the drivers in terms of how many of the practices are required for a driver to really manifest itself for the team to work. And you can see just by the scan that they're uneven. And there's some of the drivers that are more complex than others and require more of the practices than others. We did a whole variety of weightings around the practices and how they contribute at each level. And just know that underneath the things I'm going to share with you, it comes the weight of these practices and what they mean and how we use them are going to be important. Now, when I talked about Project Aristotle a little earlier, I said to you, we mapped what the Google research showed with our material, and of course, we identified the drivers that are vital to and a part of each of those factors from the Google Aristotle project, and what are the key practices. And so I've done this on several research projects that have come out. I've said, well, how do our drivers and practices map with what the researchers are finding? And what we're finding is we've really covered the territory. All of that's important to know, because when there are maladies, we want to understand where the problems are, which then enables us to have a better idea of what tactics we might use or what practices we might focus on to help a team be successful. As Bob and I talked about our many team experiences and the various consulting projects that we had, we found that the amount of misaligned talent could almost be immediately identified when you started working with a team. You had people in that room who really didn't have the skill or know-how or wherewithal to tackle the issues that the team had, and the team was having to do a lot of rework or was behind on various things, in part because there was misaligned talent. And there's other cases where the talent, if you will, exceeded what was needed, and that too presented a malady and problems. Of course, misaligned leaders. Leaders who really don't know how to work with the team, don't know how to help a team, whose style is either low engagement or hyper control of a team, all of which can, in fact, sap a team of its energies to solve a variety of problems. Now, inadequate team process, when I think about that, is not only just not having an agreement about the procedures and processes we're going to use to get things done, it's also lack of attention to what we might think of as basic team dynamics. So have we made rules about how we're going to manage conflict or differences? And most of the time that hasn't happened. The number of times when I've taken teams through team training and I get them to the place where we're talking about what are our top 10 rules to work together effectively as a team. And they get often annoyed with me because I keep pushing them to give a definitive behavior, and after which, when we have our 10, I ask them what would be an example of this not being fulfilled in our team process. And people can readily say, well, if we don't deliver our reports to each other on time, that's a dependability issue. So we are committing to, when we as a team say reports are due on such and such a day, that we are going to get them there on such and such a day. Now, the big picture, and the reason why I make such a big deal about this is, without it, accountabilities are impossible. If I can't get them to agree on what are our 10 rules of engagement, then there's no basis in which I can give you feedback as a team member or as a team leader that says, well, we had as one of our rules as a team on our dynamics and our processes that we were going to have our reports to each other on time. And we haven't done that. So what's in the way? What do we need to do to really live this rule that we've set? And we can go through each of those in that way. Without that set of standards, it's virtually impossible to deal with conflict in a productive way. Now, we all know there are different kinds of conflict. There's a conflict of you know, how I view the information and how you view the information. There's also conflict of personal history, of things where um, we've had a lot of bruises in our work together and haven't figured out a good way to smooth those over, and we bring them into the team room, if you will. And of course, teams that are so homogeneous, not merely in race or gender, but in their way of thinking about things, that they sort of get locked into a rut and simply give up on trying to deal with conflict because they would prefer the rut that they're in. Now, when teams are not engaged enough, it's usually a communication issue, and it's usually a feedback problem because people aren't getting the information they need to be successful and productive. Likewise, when they feel that there's a very rigid mindset, when people feel like there's, you know, the boss or the team leader has it all figured out, all the rules are made, this is the timetable, so there's nothing to discuss, we see that that fixed mindset tends to reduce engagement and reduce the collaborative initiative of folks in the group. Likewise, when the turnover in a team happens, and that's going to happen one way or the other, and it could be at two extremes. It isn't sufficient to bring in new blood on one hand, or on the other hand, the team members that are giving up or leaving are not the team members that we want to leave because they have certain perspectives and insight that's quite helpful. We've seen plenty of teams where the enterprise itself is not supportive, where there's a lack of resources to help the team succeed, and those at the top or who have bigger responsibilities aren't giving the messages to the group for the group to be successful. And of course, as I mentioned earlier, that the lack of accountability and the lack of saying, well, here's what we hold to be true, um, it really gets in the way when the lack of accountabilities are there. Now, I have found, and I've seen this not only in my own experience inside of a team, but also in facilitating and working with teams, that you know the potential for a high potential team, a high performing team exists when the following kind of behavior is a standard and happens. We do a team meeting, and after the team meeting, I elbow Kathy and I say, Kathy, you know, when you shared those three pieces of information about this client that we're working with, I had a fresh new view on this issue. And I thank you because that gave me some insights I wouldn't have had otherwise. To be able to give that feedback and to do it naturally is a true remarkable environment for people to be able to do that. Likewise, if I had after a meeting and it's just me and Bob, and I say, you know, Bob, every time I was trying to make a point today, you interrupted me and actually elevated your voice and tried to talk over me as I was trying to get some points out. So I'm really confused as to why that happened and puzzled about what we might need to do to have a better working relationship in this situation. So it is when that environment exists where we're making each other accountable and we expect it of each other that you've got the formula for a high performing team. Well, what you see on the screen are the practices in our libraries, and I put the primary practice that tackles each and every one of the maladies. And so what I would say is if you are beginning to see that a malady is beginning to emerge in a team, that it's evident with the team, then there's a practice that you can leverage and develop an intervention around that's really going to help the team be more successful. So it's important to know that in the library of material that we've created, it's there to not only help facilitate performance, but also to intervene when things are going off the rails. And we typically see these are the 9 causes that generate a team that, in fact, um, is going off the rails and needs a fix. Some of the other tactics we might employ, these are related, these are more particular to general tactics that we might employ in addition to, and you'll get a handout from me that covers these, so you don't have to worry about making notes of it, because I'm going to send it out to all those who registered. So you can see that there are very specific tactics that we can engage in to help us deal with, as we refer to them as the maladies on a team. Now, you won't be surprised that we believe feedback matters. In fact, as I just said in the example I gave you, I believe that the skill of giving feedback and the capacity of folks to do that requires training, requires a point of view. And if I'm on a team, I should be thinking about the notion that my team members' success is very, very important to me, and my success is important to that team members. In fact, I happened to be in England during the World Cup, and it so happened that the day after the World Cup, the interview with the French coach of the European football team that won the World Cup was asked, what do you think made the difference? And this is almost an exact quote. I brought the paper home with me, so I would have it. He said, "We didn't have the best talent on the field, as everybody knows. But what we had, no other team had. We had the psychological commitment to our success as a team over our individual glory." And he said, "I'm not a psychologist." He was very quick to say, he said, "I'm not a psychologist. I just know that the level of individual commitment to the success of the whole exceeded the worry or concern about the success of the one." And of course, that can only happen, as he described their practices, where team members are giving each other feedback and encouraging each other and doing things that enabled them to get to a level of performance where they were operating at an environment and at a level of performance that exceeded everybody else's. I've observed this in military teams, the same thing. In fact, I got to observe it up close when my son, who was a U.S. Marine Corps member, was a part of a special security team. And after a year of training, they took him off into the Sahara Desert for a year of training. And it was everything from attention to body language to a whole host of what we would think of as psychological variables for them to work together. And it was 15 of them. And they were at Camp Lejeune, which was about 4 hours from our house. And on long weekends, the team would show up at our house. Now, if you've ever tried to feed 15 Marines on a weekend, let me just tell you, just take out another mortgage. They are hungry and they are dynamic and thriving young men. But in every case, when they would pull up in the driveway and they would be standing in the driveway talking with great passion, giving each other feedback. And the first time this happened, I said to my son, I said, "Son, what is going on?" And he said, "Dad, we just finished a set of field practices and we've been giving each other feedback." I said, "You mean for the last 4 hours you've been getting?" He said, "Yes, and we got 4 more hours of feedback to go. So break out the beer and let us talk." And so they gave each other very specific feedback. And it was everything from, when you were involved in this particular practice, a field exercise, and you did X, Y, Z, here is the doubt that was created for me that you knew what to do next. And they would go through and give each other this feedback. And he reminded me many times that this is a standard practice of the team because their lives depended on being able to work at that level of performance. And I not only an independent group like the French football team, or what I've seen up close as a military team, I know that the feedback matters, and having people focus on the particulars and holding each other accountable to those particulars quite important. Well, in our system, as you know, we try to help people align and understand what is it we need to do, what's our profile, what are we doing well, what are we not doing so well. The sorting cards can help us do that. The multi-raters can help us do that. We've done our best to organize the practices in a cogent way to help people understand how they can work effectively toward the kinds of qualities that will enable the team to be successful. We believe our practices will also deal with the remedies and maladies of teams so that they can adjust as they need to keep the maladies away and the performance in front of them as they go forward. So, as I said at the beginning, yes, I happen to believe that what we did helped create a library that is useful for teams to grow and develop, and useful for helping teams find maladies that are very natural and typically evolve at some point in the life of the team that need to be taken care of, or else it will sap the energy and the success of the team.